Airplane parts, pesticides, chemicals, cans of paint, used up medical supplies, batteries, all kinds of waste, PCBs and hard drives, too many things to list. Don't worry about it, call it trash, and throw it in the burn pits.
It's just nasty, dirty, stinky.
Jet fuel to ignite the spark and wind and the flames. Tend the fire day and night. Nobody takes the blame for the burn pits. Ashes fall like snowflakes from the burn pits, stirring up a toxic crew, claiming that nobody knew the consequences of that deadly stew. Bubbling in the cauldron of the burn pits. Diseases range from head to toe, nothing offered to protect body, heart, and mind and soul. The government has no regrets. One by one the soldiers fall for reasons no one will admit. No recourse, no benefits. Hey, they were only burning pits.
That is what we live next to.
Jet fuel to ignite the spark and wind and the flames. Tend the fire day and night. Nobody takes the blame for the burn pits. Ashes fall like snowflakes from the burn pits. Ashes fall like snowflakes from the burn pits. From the burn pits. From the burn pits. From the burn pits.
Okay, this is Dan Sullivan speaking, and I'm here with Rosie Torres and Will Wisner of Burn Pits 360, and the three of us are going to be providing a advocacy briefing for Module 1 Introduction. This is Section 2 of Module 1. So everyone who is participating in this briefing or watching this briefing, the recording of this briefing, will have already watched or participated in Section 1 of Module 1, which was essentially provided the broad outlines of the advocacy program. I'm going to take us through the slides, and Will and Rosie and I will talk about various issues arising from the slides as we go. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for participating in this advocacy briefing. As you could see from the short video that was prelude to this briefing, burn pits involved the incineration in open pits of some very nasty stuff, producing chemicals that are known and recognized toxins that cause a vast array of illnesses. And today we're going to look a little bit into the history of the burn pit issue and the emerging science around the burn pit issue in the private and the public sectors. Before you came to section 2 of module 1, we asked you to watch a film, Open Fire, which was a short documentary made several years ago about the issue of burn pits, and it focused on the story of Rosie and Leroy Torres, and it also had a section that focused on me and the Sergeant Sullivan Center. So I wanted to give you some updates on the videos so that you know where we are right now. The Sergeant Sullivan Center that was mentioned in the film actually closed its doors in 2015 to establish the Sergeant Sullivan Fund at National Jewish Health's Deployment-Related Lung Disease Center. And that's essentially a way that donors can give, private donors can give money directly to the Deployment-Related Lung Disease Center. And of course, my family and the Torres families remain allied in the effort to confront burn pit associated illnesses. My father runs an entity called the Sergeant Sullivan Circle, which is a circle of advocates advocating for toxic exposure injuries, and is working with Burn Pits 360 on an upcoming congressional briefing. But that means that Burn Pits 360 is now the only national 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting veterans and their families who are enduring problems associated with toxic wartime exposures. Other organizations may speak about this issue or address this issue as part of their vast number of programs, but Burn Pits 360 is the only nonprofit that is exclusively dedicated to this issue and exclusively works on this particular issue. With the help of its sponsors, Burn Pits 360 is in the process of launching a dynamic new website. Is that already launched, Rosie? The new website?
Give me a second, because I muted my. I muted my audio there for a second.
Oh.
Not yet. We're hoping to have that done before the end of the month. We just have had some delays on their side, but they're working with their developers. But that's coming up very, very soon.
But a new website, a dynamic new website, is about to be put out for Burn Pits 360 with a continuation of the independent registry for veterans with toxic exposure issues. So those are just some updates on Open Fire on the documentary, and we wanted to give participants an opportunity to ask any questions or share any statements they might have in relation to the video Open Fire. So this is one of our brief Q&A periods. I'm not sure how many people are logged on to participate.
Well, I think in true fashion with the pilot program, I'm trying to figure out the bugs for when we take this thing beyond pilot, seems to be is that they are all bouncing back to my username, although it looks like B was able to join in without any problem. And I think Susan is probably on as myself. So I want to figure out who's where the disconnect is. But let's just keep right on going.
Just keep going. Okay, very good.
So yeah.
All right. Okay, there's a slide here. We're going to actually not review the quiz results for quiz 1 and 2 because not everybody has completed the quizzes yet. So we'd like all participants to go ahead and complete quizzes 1 and 2 from module 1, and then there will be module 1, section 1, that is. They're just very brief, short answer quizzes, not short answer, multiple choice questions on SurveyMonkey. It takes about a minute to do each quiz, and so everybody can go ahead and do that, and we will reserve discussion of the quizzes for a later briefing. Module 1 is an introduction to the history of burn pits and to burn pits themselves. And over the course of this briefing, we will hope to provide answers to the following questions. What is a burn pit? What toxins are emitted by burn pits? What health problems do these toxins cause? Who was exposed to burn pits? When were warnings issued that burn pits could pose health hazards for veterans? And how were these initial warnings addressed? Burn pits were a common way to get rid of waste at military sites in Iraq and Afghanistan. Burning waste in open-air pits can cause more pollution than controlled burning, such as in an incinerator. Toxins in burn pit smoke may affect eyes, skin, respiratory and cardiovascular systems, gastrointestinal tract, and internal organs. Waste products in burn pits include, but are not limited to, chemicals, paint, medical and human waste, metal, aluminum cans, munitions, and other unexploded ordnance, petroleum and lubricant products, plastics, rubber, wood, and discarded food. Now, you saw a lot of nasty stuff being burned in the video, and the combination of these items being burned created plumes full of chemicals that have recognized health impacts in scientific literature, and may also have health impacts when a person is exposed to them. They might have synergistic health impacts as well. So the language that I just read to you that's on this slide is actually from the VA's Office of Public Health website. This is the VA's definition of a burn pit, and it's pretty consistent with the definition of a burn pit that it's pretty consistent with what a burn pit actually is and was. What we saw in the video and what we're seeing here are consistent. We already watched the video, so I'm going to skip that. We want to discuss briefly the burn pit at Joint Base Balad, because that's probably the most famous or infamous of the burn pits, and it is the burn pit where that essentially started everything when it comes to people becoming aware that burn pits might have short and long-term health effects. But at the height of the war in Iraq, U.S. forces operated out of 505 bases scattered across the country. According to the New York Times, there were over 250 burn pits at these bases and outposts that were operational during major operations. Joint Base Balad, a 15 square mile outpost north of Baghdad, was the second largest of the 505 bases. And those stationed there noticed the smoke, plumes of it curling into the air at all hours of the day, sometimes lingering over the base as dark, foreboding clouds. That smoke was coming from Balad's open-air burn pit. The pit, a shallow excavation measuring a gargantuan 10 acres, was used to incinerate every single piece of refuge generated by Balad's thousands of residents. These words were written by Katie Drummond, who was also in The Verge, and Katie was also the producer of the documentary that we had you watch. This is a continuation. That meant that seemingly innocuous items like food scraps or paper, but it also meant plastic, styrofoam, electronics, metal cans, rubber tires, ammunition, explosives, human feces, animal carcasses, lithium batteries, asbestos insulation, and human body parts, all of it doused in jet fuel and lit on fire. This pit was not unique to Balad. Open-air pits operated either by service members or contractors were used to dispose of trash at bases all across Iraq and Afghanistan. So I don't know how familiar everybody is with environmental exposures, but these elements, these items that were burned, the plastics, styrofoam, etc., and so forth, are actually highly toxic in various forms, and when they're burned, they become even more toxic. Styrofoam, for example, is toxic when you pour. You use. In many states are actually outlawing the use of styrofoam for styrofoam coffee cups. DC, Washington District of Columbia is one of them, because the heat from the coffee causes the styrofoam to become toxic, and then you swallow it, and it has negative health impacts. So all of these things and asbestos is a good example of a well-recognized toxic substance that causes lung disease. All of these things were being burned in the burn pits, and we're getting into the smoke plumes, and the smoke plumes were dispersing these toxic chemicals throughout the military installations where they were being used. Rosie, you have a connection, I believe, to Joint Base Balad. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, or about your feelings or opinions about the burn pit at Joint Base Balad?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, I guess what I have to say about Balad, of course, as many of us do know, and those that don't, this was one of the largest burn pits in theater, over 10 acres in size, and tons and tons of waste being burned daily. My husband was stationed in Balad, Camp Anaconda, and was from his deployment to Balad, that resulted in several health diseases and issues that he's now been diagnosed with, that started off like your brother. His experience with receiving a diagnosis was that it was all psychosomatic, but now here we are almost a decade later with the diagnosis of toxic encephalopathy, which is toxic brain injury, constrictive bronchiolitis. It wasn't asthma, it wasn't anxiety, it was a progressive lung disease that is irreversible. So there is no treatment for that. So yes, we're very familiar with Balad, a lot of toxins detected. And this is also the burn pit that is mentioned in the VA training letter, where they identify the toxins detected in the air sampling, as well as what areas of the body are affected when there's combustion burning of this type.
Right. You mentioned something about something that just struck me about your husband, but Leroy, about how it wasn't anxiety, but didn't a VA facility diagnose his condition as anxiety before he actually was diagnosed by private care providers at some point?
Right. So we went to several healthcare facilities, including both DOD and VA. And where he did receive that diagnosis was at the VA War-Related Illness and Injury Center in Washington.
Right.
And was told that, I have the document that states that their decision, their medical opinion was that his symptoms did not require any further, pulmonary evaluation, and much less an open lung biopsy. That was not their recommendation at all, and they stuck by the diagnosis of unknown etiology at one point, and then it being anxiety upon discharge. So no continuity of care, misdiagnosed, and then we ended up going to Dr. Robert Miller over at Vanderbilt University.
Right, and that kind of tracks my brother's story. My brother, who was a Marine, served in Iraq and died of exposure-related illnesses that were detectable on autopsy. He was diagnosed by DOD with a somatoform disorder, which is essentially like having a psychosomatic illness. And only his autopsy revealed that he was having multi-organ failure, brain swelling, all sorts of terrible things that were physiologic in nature. So I just thought when you mentioned that to highlight that there's a lot of misdiagnosis going on at VA and DOD, and yet it's hard to understand why this misdiagnosis would occur when we have clear evidence of exposures like the types of exposures that occurred in when a veteran is exposed to the plumes from a burn pit. And as Rosie mentioned, DOD took samples of the burn pit plumes at Balad and found a host of extremely toxic substances, and each of these substances is connected with unique health risks. But yet, knowing that veterans and service members were exposed to these chemicals, VA and DOD continued to misdiagnose illnesses that are traceable or could be fairly traceable to exposure to these chemicals as anxiety or psychosomatic illness or conversion disorder. It's a problematic situation. I think it might be getting a little bit better, but it's I believe it's still happening.
No, I have to say that it's not getting better. That
Really?
Yeah, I've heard here in the last week and continue to hear from reservists, active duty. Actually had my son just call me. He's in the Army, and one of his sergeants who deployed to the Middle East a few times is being told that his issues are just all a result of him having asthma. And so he immediately said, well, you need to talk to my parents because it's probably not asthma. As we all know that most servicemen and women that seek treatment for any pulmonary related issues are prescribed inhalers and it doesn't resolve the symptom, right? So I just don't see it getting better on the DoD side. So
maybe it's getting a different kind of minimization. It's really unfortunate that it's not getting better. I was hoping that after years of being confronted with this issue by advocates that DoD or VA might budge a little bit, but unfortunately it looks like we're the situation that you saw in the documentary Open Fire is pretty much similar to the situation that we have right now, according to what Rosie's saying and according to what I'm hearing from other people who've been recently involved in advocacy and who I've heard tell their stories on the Burn Pits 360 podcast, which happens Tuesdays from 7 to 9, I believe.
And hey, Dan, I actually had a comment that I think is a good talking point for our outreach advocates whenever they're talking. Because in theory, what we're wanting everybody to do at that level 1 level of responsibility is, talking to any group that will listen to us, really. But one of the things that's misunderstood, I'm going to back the slide up if that's okay, to go to the that first bullet where it's talking about the seemingly innocuous items. That's one of the things that I think that unless you were over there, it's really kind of hard to comprehend. They said that every soldier was, generating over 10 pounds of trash a day on their own. And if you think about it, when we would go into those chow halls, if you were lucky enough to be on a fob that had a DFAC, everybody had the paper plate, the little sleeve with the fork and the spoon, the salt and the pepper packet and all that. If you think about the sheer volume of trash that's generating, just on that, 3 meals a day times however many soldiers are there. On top of that, soda cans. On top of that, plastic Gatorade jugs or what have you. On top of that, a lot of larger fobs had Pizza Hut, Subway, Green Beans, all these different things. There is a lot of trash that is being generated that they have to do something with. At one point, the decision was made to burn it. And I think if you go back into that 2006 letter from Colonel Curtis, I think it talks about that when that decision was made and the advice given to the contrary. But that is a really useful point to, I think, use to paint the picture for advocates when they're out talking to these VFWs. Because, like, my dad's a Vietnam vet, and he talks about, well, we had burn pits. But, he's thinking, the old bathroom waste burning in the 55-gallon drum with the diesel fuel. And I know that they did have larger things. We had burn pits back in the 90s on the MFO mission in South Camp in Egypt, but it's not the same beast. This is industrial scale stuff that's being generated by not only just KBR, exactly like as the other me, I think Bob is saying. So it wasn't just the military there. KBR, those folks generate enormous amounts of trash. And just keep adding on to that and adding on to that. That's really kind of a key point I think people should really keep in mind when explaining this issue. It helps paint the picture. At any rate, sorry to derail. Just wanted to bring
the old-fashioned style burn pits, what they are distinguishable from the Iraq burn and Afghanistan burn pits. You're saying in that they burned different things, or they burned things on a smaller scale, or both.
And somebody else had made the point up there earlier where people were burning pesticides that clearly had, extremely hazardous when burned, on the label. It's just because everything went into this thing. But if you think of just of that chow analogy, the chow hall analogy, that's what kind of set apart the different types of installations that were in use, whether it was an expeditionary encampment or whether it was a fully established fob or what have you, is the amount of things that generate trash. When the contractors are there, that is the military-industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a war and you roll in from the wire where something horrific happened and, you roll in and grab your cup of whatever from the Green Beans coffee place. It's surreal to think about it now, this many years removed. It was nice to have when you're there, but yeah, absolutely, that was contributive. In my dad's day, it was probably a lot more like an episode of MASH, where you go to the chow hall, you get your little stainless steel tray that's stamped out with the area for your food, and you had your cutlery, and at the end of your meal, you kind of went through the little 3 dip tanks, with the soap and the less soap and the rinse water. And then you filled up your canteen from a Lister bag. So just the sheer volume is probably the most important. And of course, all the other things that are unique to what we had, this is a long war. This thing's been going on 18 years now. And If you look at just vehicles, military vehicles, well, those have carc paint, which is a type of paint that's chemically retardant. So, I mean, that stuff is made to protect you from chemical attack. Well, that stuff's pretty hazardous anyway. You burn it, that's some bad stuff coming up off that. So there's definitely, I mean, it's the perfect cocktail storm of just anything and everything you can think of in this thing. Balad, for instance, I mean, that thing was like 11 acres big. It's mind blowing, just the scale. But anyhow, I digress.
Yeah, those are good points. In this next slide, I wanted to highlight how long ago the DoD received warnings of the hazards posed by burn pits. I see a typo here, which I will correct orally, but in 2006, Lieutenant Colonel Darren Curtis, and I believe Darren actually should have 2 R's, so apologies for that. Lieutenant Colonel Darren Curtis, bioengineering flight commander for the U.S. Air Force, wrote an official memorandum with the subject heading Burn Pit Hazards. After observing and taking samples of the Balad burn pit, he wrote, "In my professional opinion, there is an acute health hazard for individuals. There is also the possibility of chronic health hazards associated with the smoke." So this was all the way back in 2006 that there was within the DoD itself an effort to try to address the health hazards of burn pits and to alert DoD officials to the health hazards of burn pits. But Fox News reported in 2018 that burn pits are actually still being used to dispose of refuse at U.S. military bases. Rosie and Will, what do you think is going on here, and what's your knowledge of the fact that that burn pits appear to be in continual use even to this day?
I'm only aware of that anecdotally. I mean, I've certainly talked to people that, my son, brother, cousin, whatever is currently over there and they're still using them. And my understanding of it is that what they've done is essentially hired locals to operate burn pits. And since it's the local nationals that are actually running it, it's kind of outside of the ability, I guess, for the military, or they're just not going to do anything about it. That was kind of my understanding. Again, that's totally anecdotal. Rosie, do you have anything more solid on that?
I don't. We are working on some stuff with on some efforts with the nonprofit to make sure that those laws and policies in place are really tightened down, and they're written in the best way possible so that things are regulated and oversight is conducted in an effective manner. But we'll have to report back on where they are in Congress with this, and if there are any if there's any legislation in place that requires some kind of monitoring program that mandates DoD to report back on where they are with safety guidelines and such.
And we did submit in that request, Rosie, through with Pogo folks, about asking for that information on places that are currently in use. So hopefully that will come back sooner rather than later from our congressional contact that's supposed to look into that for us.
Well, so in 2006, Lieutenant Colonel Curtis alerts officials to the hazards of the burn pit, particularly the Balad burn pit. What happens after that? Does the Balad burn pit continue to burn?
Yes. Yeah.
It just burns, right? They just, and nobody jumped up and said, "Oh dear, this is a health hazard and we should be using incinerators." It was just allowed to burn, and essentially the risk that DoD became aware of, if it was not aware of the risk already, when Lieutenant Colonel Curtis wrote this memorandum. It appears as though the memorandum was essentially set aside, and operations with the use of burn pits continued despite there being knowledge that these were significant environmental health risks.
Yeah, and really somebody made the comment earlier. It's one of my many clones, I guess, in the chat room right now had pointed out that they live in a city of 25,000 people, and that's that's not far off from what's on a fob, and you think about how much trash a city of 25,000 people generate in a day. That's what's being generated, and what do you do with it? So if you can't burn it, if Colonel Curtis is saying, "Hey guys, this is bad stuff," you still got to do something with it. The more interesting point to me is that how that highlights just how people react to authority. I mean, so many people talk about being near the burn pits, recognizing, hey, this is bad news. There's no way this is good. There's no way this is healthy. But yet, what are you going to do about it? What really can you do about it? So you just keep on keeping on. The fact that they had people in there, like, when we talked to Jeremy Downs on the podcast, and he's talking about they had him scavenging for boots to replace, worn out boots from the burn pit, stuff like that. That's where it goes off the rails crazy.
Right. So in February 2010, a group of private medical professionals and DoD VA medical professionals met together in Denver at National Jewish Health. They called themselves the Denver Working Group, and looking at the health risks of exposures, particularly pulmonary or lung exposures from smoke and particulate matter in Iraq and Afghanistan, they recommended pre- and post-deployment lung function tests, a test called spirometry for military personnel. And the reason they did this is because a lot of very sick individuals returning from the theater of war with pulmonary disease were testing all the same for normal, as having normal lung function or lung function within the normal range in spirometry. Unfortunately, in that you can still have a normal lung function test or spirometry reading within the normal range, even if you have significant lung disease. And the only way that you can really get a sense of whether someone's lungs are deteriorating is if you have a baseline reading pre-deployment of how their lungs were functioning prior to the exposure during deployment. So this work group said basically you need to get the baseline reading. How do military personnel's lungs function prior to deployment, and then do a lung function test after deployment to see if lung function has significantly degraded, and that could be an indication of lung disease. Absent that pre-deployment lung function test, you don't have the data sufficient to make a diagnosis of lung disease necessarily. Deployment related. Yeah.
I was just going to talk on that point for a quick second too, as another anecdotal story that might help kind of, give some material to talk about when I'm in these presentations. But if you remember, Dan, when I and your father went to that secret squirrel meeting they had in Wright-Patterson, the
Defense Health Board.
Yeah, the Defense Health Board. That was like about 2014. when they intentionally had this. I mean, the point of the meeting was to give the recommendations down to DoD and VA,
Right.
based off of what they feel needs to be done. And so they hid, really. I mean, and that how you remember it, Dan? They didn't want reporters and people like us, I guess, going. So they had this thing out in the middle of nowhere,
Right.
Someplace in Ohio, I think it was. At any rate, we made that recommendation based on what came out of this 2010 recommendation. And if you remember, one of the games the military plays at that point, the official response that I remember them giving us at that meeting was that, well, that's all sounds nice, but unfortunately, this is such a complicated military or medical procedure that it cannot be entrusted to lowly enlisted people who would be the ones doing the job. They're essentially too stupid to perform a PFT, or not even a PFT, it's spirometry. Just see how the ball's dancing on the airflow. And I think that's we made the counterpoint that enlisted forward observers are putting steel on steel from artillery, over tremendous distances. They can surely read a ball that's bouncing around on somebody's breath. But that's just a side story.
Yeah, no, the Defense Health Board essentially recommended. I think they did what they normally do. What normal the catchphrase for delaying science and medical health and healthcare in this area is essentially the catchphrase is this question requires further study. We have to study whether it's feasible to do pre-deployment lung function tests. Actually, we have to first study whether it's feasible to do a feasibility study.
Yeah.
It's a Rick Weidman of the Vietnam Veterans of America describes this catchphrase and others as the delay, deny, wait till they die tactic. Yeah. So, but the interesting thing about this February meeting in 2010 is that there were DoD and VA professionals who were present for the meeting, and they joined together with the private medical professionals in writing a paper that made a recommendation for pre- and post-deployment lung function tests. They all agreed that that was medically a good idea, but we're going to, a little bit later on, find out what happened with that, because something happened. Build a little suspense. But before we get to what happened next with that, I wanted to discuss the VA's training letter. So in April 2010, VA issued a training letter indicating that there might be possible adverse synergistic health effects caused by, and then it lists the types of exposures that we know came from burn pit plumes: high levels of particulate matter, numerous toxic organic halogenated dioxins and furans. Dioxin, if you recall, you may or may not recall, is actually essentially the chemical that was at issue with Agent Orange. So we're not necessarily looking at a new Agent Orange here. We're looking at a continuation of the Agent Orange issue. Here we have dioxins in the Vietnam War causing health problems, and now we have dioxins in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars causing health problems. Known and unknown polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and volatile organic compounds. These are all things that you can get exposed to in at home as well. But there are EPA regulations in place that prevent high dose exposure to these types of things in within the United States. All bets were off with burn pits. These were environmental disaster sites, essentially. If you had a burn pit in Cleveland, whoever was operating it would probably be put in handcuffs and then imprisoned for putting the residents of Cleveland at risk. The letter further indicates, because of the widespread nature of burn pits and the inability of military personnel records to identify all duty locations, a veteran's lay statement of burn pit exposure should be sufficient to establish the occurrence of such exposure if the veteran served in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Djibouti. Regional office personnel must also be aware that many veterans suffering from illnesses such as respiratory, cardiopulmonary, neurological, autoimmune, or skin disorders may not associate such conditions with burn pit exposure. So the inference you can draw here from the text is that VA rating authorities should, according to this training letter, accept a veteran's statement that he or she was exposed to a burn pit as sufficient to prove that they were exposed to a burn pit, and that there's probably a lot of veterans with illnesses that were caused by burn pits who may not know that those conditions were caused by burn pit exposures, giving the rating authorities the responsibility, really, of educating the veteran about the fact that their illnesses may be the result of a deployment exposure from burn pits. The letter finally concludes, further, if toxin exposure is raised by a veteran, he or she will generally not be aware of what toxins were released by burn pits. Rating authorities must therefore be prepared to actively review such claims by recognizing potential exposure issues whenever they are reasonably raised by the record, and then developing those claims in accordance with the instructions herein. Rosie, what does the VA actually do with this training letter?
I don't think they use it. They're supposed to use it. The purpose of the letter was to develop for the VA adjudicators to use in assisting them when determining that when someone submitted a claim, and then they used it as a resource, I guess, along with what I'm now learning is the DoD link of those. What are those documents? Well, I'm sorry, the ones that I mentioned to you the other night.
The
What are they
poems?
called? The poems, right? So apparently they're using poems. They're using. I think they're using the letter. They didn't mention much about the letter at this symposium, but it's wonderful that you asked this, because as you're asking me this question, I pulled up a picture, a photo I took of one of the slides at the recent symposium, and I'm just going to read it. It says tips for claim submission. Number 1, file your claim for compensation prior to discharge. That's ridiculous. Meaning prior to being discharged from the military, I guess. Number 2, indicate whether there was any treatment in service along with these dates. In other words, line of duty. They want some kind of acknowledgement that this happened in theater. Provide specific exposure information, date range of exposure to burn pits, location, proximity, and frequency of exposure to burn pits, when symptoms occurred for the first time, and provide any other important details, other exposures during service. I wasn't able to capture any more than that because they didn't distribute the presentations, but in regards to this letter, I just don't think that it's fulfilling its purpose. But there are other ways that you can utilize this letter. But in regards to rating and compensation, I really don't feel that it gives you a hand up in any way, or that it gives you a great resource to support your claim.
Where the value on this thing is, and what we want our advocates to really zero in on, is that this letter and the Curtis document, the Colonel Curtis from the previous page, these are all available on our website. You can go to burnpits360.org. You can go to burnpits360network.org. In the library section, it's all there. And in fact, the letter we're talking about now, the 10-3, it has its very own section, which is as a outside the library because it's that important. Now, my personal experience with it has been hot and cold. I try to make it a practice of anytime I know I'm going to have a new doctor or someone I've not met, I generally try to carry in that 10-3 letter with me and explain what it is and give it to the doctor. Sometimes I've had people that have received it, cordially and have reviewed it, and then the next time I saw them, like it's obvious that they read it. I've had other people that have straight told me, I don't have time to look at that. So your mileage will vary, but we want advocates to press that when they're out doing that presentation. This thing exists. You have to advocate for yourself. So download the 10-3 letter, keep it with you whenever you go for your health care, and give a copy because it may make a difference. They may take you that much more serious, and it may be a good way to head off what we were talking about earlier in the chat about the psych issues. It may prevent you from getting labeled, which that could save your life down the road.
Right. So the letter has utility as a something that a veteran can carry with them to the doctor. Or Rosie, don't veterans sometimes submit the letter with their claims?
Right. So you can submit it with your claims. Right. There's two purposes. So one is submitted with your claim when filing a claim. Go ahead and attach it to your claim, and any other environmental air sampling letters that you may have been given on base, like the Balad air sampling letter, and I heard there's one, a Bagram, and I think that's also on our website. And number two, like Will mentioned, we here at Burn Pits 360 highly recommend you utilizing this training letter as some type of evidence and guidance for your medical provider, whether it's at the VA, at DOD, in the civilian sector. Utilize it as a clinical guideline to help your doctor, one, acknowledge that you have a history of exposure, that you were deployed to a place where there was combustion burning as a result of burn pit, as a result of burn pits. But use it, take it with you to every doctor's appointment, hand it to your doctor, make lots of copies. That's really what we recommend that you use it for.
And
both
for
filing claims.
Yeah, for our advocates, that needs to be the biggest tool in your tool bag. That should always be the number one go-to tool at every presentation, every time you're talking to somebody that's just figuring out what this issue is about.
So it's a good tool, and knowing that the VA training letter and the Curtis memo came from within VA and DoD gives them added credibility, I think. So something happened in June 2011, and that is that Dr. Matt King and Dr. Robert Miller of Vanderbilt University Medical Center published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine announcing that through lung biopsies of military personnel with respiratory issues, and these were all people with normal spirometry, they uncovered presentation of a rare disease of the small airways called constrictive bronchiolitis. And constrictive bronchiolitis is a classic environmental occupational illness caused by exposures. No question that its most common cause is exposure to toxic chemicals. This was the first objective evidence of a connection between inhalational exposures and a diagnosable disease. So DOD responded by stopping to send military personnel to Dr. Miller and King for a special consult in cases of unusual respiratory issues.
Could you explain that story a little bit, Dan? Just tell that story, because I think that's a critical one for people to have at least heard.
Which do you want to tell it?
No. You do so much better. The whole Dr. Miller and the 101st Airborne story.
Yeah, I think you'd tell it better than me right now.
Well, the long
I
and short.
can tell it.
Okay, how about
go ahead,
Rosie
Will.
tells it? Okay.
Okay, so bottom line, what happened, what occurred was, DOD had a group of about 65 soldiers, correct me if I'm wrong, out of Fort Campbell, who many of them, top of their health, as far as they should have been on top of their health, like very young, athletic young men and women, but that couldn't really go up a flight of stairs without having some respiratory distress. So the DOD sent this group of soldiers to Dr. Miller at Vanderbilt University, conducted a study, and after PFTs came back normal and the routine, health exams just were not giving them the answers to the issue, they decided to opt for open lung biopsies, which in the end indicated that these young men and women were actually suffering from a progressive, irreversible disease of the small airways due to toxic inhalation. And, and since then, I don't think that DOD has sent any more young men and women to Dr. Miller, since he's decided to stick by the discovery he made and opted not to give the diagnosis of asthma, because it's not asthma. So that, long story short, that's what happened, and that's how Dr. Miller got involved and Dr. King.
Yeah, the takeaway there is really, we have a mystery thing, and we can't identify what's going on. We need research, and what's going on here. And he put a finger on it and said, "This is what's going on." So, of course, the next logical step in military thinking is to not allow anyone to see him again. And I know there's been some, attacks on his credibility. I mean, the guy's taken some shots for saving lives. It's really kind of a disgusting little chapter in this story.
Yeah, Dr. Miller endured a lot of attacks on his credibility from the DOD, to the point at which they were practically essentially saying he was lying and made up the diagnosis of constrictive bronchiolitis. They even went so far as to hire National Jewish Health to review Dr. Miller's lung biopsies to confirm or deny that they were actually constrictive bronchiolitis. And I believe National Jewish Health confirmed that Dr. Miller's diagnoses were in fact accurate. But he's kind of a hero doctor in this area, because he stood his ground, and he stood his ground against some very powerful interests that did the best that they could to destroy his credibility. But he's still here, and he's still standing by his diagnosis.
And he's going to be one of our panelists at DC on the 30th.
That will. Thank you for. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about that, actually?
Go ahead, Rosie.
No, just that he's one of our panelists at the congressional briefing on April 30th, and we're just excited to have him. I mean, this is a doctor that is a hero in the veteran community of those young men and women affected that are being told that they're just bottom line crazy, and so he really is a hero. If any of you have seen the movie Concussion with Will Smith, this reminds me a lot of that story, that storyline, that discovery, the backlash, but like Dan said, he stands by his discovery, his diagnosis, his work, and he continues to brief Congress, and we will see him hopefully on April 30th in Washington, where he will be presenting and giving a presentation.
And the remarkable thing about the doctors who are who give presentations on this issue, like Dr. Miller, like Dr. Zema, and some of the other doctors who have remained committed to the cause of truth and justice, essentially, is that they really don't get anything out of it. In fact, it's harder on them than it is easier for them. They're not getting speakers' fees. They're not getting, praised by the scientific and medical community. They're doing this because they believe in what's right and what's true, and they're persistent. They're as persistent as Rosie Torres in continuing to get the message out about toxic exposure, and it takes a toll on them, I believe, to have to continue to say the same thing over and over again, to have their reputations threatened, but they continue to do it because they know it's right and they know what's true. And I told you that something happened with the Denver working group. So in this slide, I'm going to tell you what happened. In June 2012, the DoD VA medical professionals who attended that meeting that I mentioned in 2010 and signed a paper recommending pre- and post-deployment lung function tests. In 2012, when that article was published in the Journal of Environmental and Occupational Medicine, in a special edition, they tacked on a clarifying paper. It was signed only by the DoD VA medical professionals who had signed the previous paper recommending pre- and post-deployment lung function tests. They retracted that recommendation and they did it in the form of a clarification that they actually believed that further study was necessary to determine if pre- and post-deployment lung function tests were actually possible and necessary. And both of these articles, the recommendations of the pre- and post-deployment lung function tests and the DoD VA clarifications, were published in the June 2012 edition of the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And really, the clarifications undermined the recommendations. I know from anecdotally that the DoD medical professionals who originally recommended pre- and post-deployment spirometry, then retracted that recommendation, were put under tremendous amount of professional pressure to sign this clarifications article. It wasn't something they did because they decide, oh, oops, I actually meant to, I actually didn't mean what I said. They published this clarifications article because the chain of command ordered them to. And I even heard that at least one of the scientists was told if she didn't sign it, she would be stationed somewhere in the theater of war and put at risk. So it was an unfortunate. That just kind of shows you the kind of pressure that these doctors can be put under, to the point at which they will go so far as to retract what they previously agreed to because of pressure from within the DoD. Now, I don't have any any objective evidence that I can furnish you of what I just said in terms of the pressure actually happened. As I said, it's just anecdotal evidence from my own conversations with people who were involved in the recommendations and the clarifications. Will or Rosie, do you have any comments on this slide?
No, I think you hit the bottom line takeaway to me on that is that in this era, this about a 3-year window, 4-year window maybe, it was pretty aggressive. I mean, as far as people, like you said, having to go so far as retract previous statements.
Yeah, and so that just gives you a sense of the kind of pressure that doctors like Dr. Miller, although Dr. Miller is lucky to the extent that he's not, he's independent. He works for Vanderbilt, not for the DoD. But the kind of personal and professional pressure that he's endured, and doctors like him have endured, is heavy. It takes a lot of gumption, a lot of character, and a lot of heroism, really, to not be among those physicians who would sign a document like the clarifications. Dr. Miller could have easily clarified that he didn't mean constrictive bronchiolitis, he meant asthma, but it just looked like constrictive bronchiolitis. But he didn't. He stood by what he believed to be and what has ultimately determined to be the truth. The diagnosis was true. There's now a quiz, except we're not going to do the quiz right now.
It'll be posted on the advocacy website, BP360 Network.
It's another Survey Monkey quiz. But this is an opportunity for Q&A or group discussion.
And I flipped it over to the Q&A mode, so I believe everybody would be able to ask any questions if you have one. All right, let's keep right on going then.
Well, I see Paul is typing something.
Well, I think Paul's one of the Wills, maybe. Or is he? No, Paul's Paul. Paul?
Well, he's typing something. Maybe.
I think I sent him a request for audio. He should be able to just pipe through on the mic.
He's asked a question. Have you seen individuals with lung injury, CB, that don't have fluctuation in their pulse oximeter readings? Rosie, you might be in the best position to answer that question.
Have you seen individuals with lung injury, constrictive bronchiolitis,
that don't have fluctuation in their pulse oximeter readings?
That's a tough question to answer. I mean, I don't think it's a great question.
It's a great question,
but not one that we actually monitor in regards to the registry, or it's not a topic that's come up very often. But that is a great question. And as far as us personally, as a family, Leroy's pulse oximeter readings do fluctuate. So I don't know. That'd probably be a good question for the doctors. We can ask that to the
that's
doctors.
one of the things that we've recommended that vets do is to get pulse oximeters so that they can monitor their oxygen levels and then use that as evidence that there might be something wrong with their lungs, right?
Yeah.
I would think that there's generally going to be fluctuations if you're dealing with constrictive bronchiolitis. I think once you get outside of that, you're into because I am of the camp that like CB and burn pits is probably on the smaller side of the actual scale of the toxic injury. I think the dust over there was probably a lot more prolific. Just because, there was a lot of the baby powder consistency moon dust, the really small stuff. I think a lot of that's a lot of abrasion type injuries that are down in those lungs, which is a whole different beast. It's similar, but it's different as far as how it plays out. That stuff I don't know, but yeah, I think that would be a good question for the doctors this next week. We'll follow up on it. Paul says, because without it, if a physician sees shortness of breath but sees no drop in O2, it pushes them more towards psych. Yeah. I have my kids that served, and how long does one start to see some problems? From B.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it varies. That varies from individual to individual. I mean, we have young men and women that are actually medevaced out of theater due to all different types of diseases and symptoms, and then you have those that the onset of a malignancy or a disease could be up to 20 years, is what I was told by a toxicologist that we actually hired for my husband. So let me just tell you a little bit about that real quickly. We hired a toxicologist. We showed her the VA training letter that identified the dioxins. We asked the question, how long before someone is symptomatic and shows signs of symptoms related to any of these dioxins and organs affected? And she said anywhere between 1 and 20 years because of the effects of combustion burning. It could happen. It can start while you're in theater and then, be dormant and so forth. So it all depends on the individual, the level of exposure, the duration. It's just a lot of factors.
And I think sorry, Rosie, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to say it was from an advocacy and outreach angle, what we kind of want people to convey is that there is no normal, right? The defining, to me, the defining nature of this whole over-encompassing thing is that so many people are sick and have no idea that they're sick. And they have been to the doctor and they have, they do a simple PFT or something, it comes back, nothing wrong with you. And, next thing you know, you're going down that road towards the psych issues. It's the main message I guess we want people to convey is, you got to be your own advocate. That 10-3 letter, beat people over the head with that 10-3 letter. Take that in. Make sure you're advocating for your own care because it's very, very easy. It's why we call the podcast on Tuesdays gaslighting, because really that's what the government's doing. They're gaslighting. There's so many people. It's so easy to be convinced. This authority figures telling you that you're crazy. It's very easy to just accept that and end up falling into that trap. The second question I saw on there was from Jessica saying, does the VA environmental care coordinators help facilitate more in-depth pulmonary or cardio function? Depends on the environmental coordinator. What I think we found, and Rosie can probably expand on this, is that oftentimes these people are less informed than you volunteers that are in this room right now.
Yeah, I'm writing the question down. Sorry. Yes. So, right, Will, you're correct. Dan, I'll let Dan talk a little bit about that one sort of investigation we did. Remember that, Dan, when we called around to different facilities?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
we did a small scale investigation of environmental health coordinators selecting locations throughout the United States, and the investigation involved email contacts as well as telephone contacts, and then records were made of the telephone contacts, basically to see if the environmental health coordinators knew about the burn pit registry itself or the burn pit registry exam that is supposed to be available to veterans after they complete the burn pit registry questionnaire online. And the vast majority of environmental health coordinators didn't know what the burn pit registry exam was. They actually insisted, a lot of them insisted that veterans get a Persian Gulf War registry exam, which is a completely different thing. So we essentially found that the environmental health coordinators are not educated in burn pit exposures, the burn pit registry, and the burn pit registry exam that is supposed to be made available to all registrants in the burn pit registry.
And that's one of the things we want for this outreach program for those level 1 volunteers is we want you to reach out to the environmental coordinator in your area. Make contact with that individual and say, hey, I'm a volunteer for Burn Pits 360. We deal with issues of military toxic exposure illnesses. I'm calling to ask what you know about burn pits, or are there things that you would like to know? And if you do not have the resources that you feel you're comfortable with, give me a wish list. And, then for you to then come back to Burn Pits 360 and say, I talked to this person. This is kind of what they would, like some help with, and we'll help prepare the advocates to gather that together so that then you guys can go back and do a formal presentation with that environmental care person. And I'll tell you what, I have found, I travel for my job, and I am all over the country. And so I come in contact with a lot of different VAs. And usually when I talk to these doctors, after I get them to buy off on the idea that I'm just not a know-it-all quack, just talking out my ass or something, that they actually listen to what I'm saying, the general will ask if we're available to come and do like a presentation to their staff. So I mean, there's certainly these people are not above that. I think they realize that there's something going on, and I think that they realize that they're needing to close the gap because it is a matter of life and death in some situations. So, we want you guys to step into that breach, and that's exactly why we're putting this program on. Because I can't, I'm only one guy, Rosie's only one gal, Dan's only one guy. Everybody in this room, we're all starting out just as our individuals, and we need to grow this network to share this information. So, and when you be asked, can you say who to call again? Please, I was writing the environmental health coordinator at your local VA. To be in that list of groups when we get to module 3 and identifying the battlefield, we'll put you on target with those folks, and we'll give you a list of the ideal who to contact, and they'll be in that.
Should I continue? Are we done with Q&A, or are we still going?
Let's wrap up the slides and come back.
All right. So there are a few take-home resources that go along with Module 1. And as Will mentioned before, all of these resources are actually available on the Burn Pits 360 website already. The first resources is the Burn Pit Memorandum from Lieutenant Colonel Darren Curtis, Early Warnings of the Hazard. Resource B is the VA Burn Pit Training Letter, what every VA official and really every doctor should already know about burn pit exposures. And the resource C is the article from the New England Journal of Medicine, in which there is a discussion of how doctors Miller and King discovered constrictive bronchiolitis in service members through conducting lung biopsies. So those are resources that you can bring with you on advocacy meetings. They're resources you could summarize for people when having advocacy meetings with them, but they're kind of essential reading for an advocate in this area. So next up is Module 2. We're coming to the end of Module 1. In Module 2, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss the state of efforts through litigation to recover damages for veterans exposed to toxic burn pit fumes. We're going to discuss the effectiveness of the VA DoD Burn Pit and Airborne Hazards Registry to collect actionable data to assist veterans exposed to toxic burn pit fumes and to educate veterans about burn pit exposures through a public information campaign. We'll discuss the state of VA healthcare for exposed veterans, current legislative efforts, most pending to assist exposed veterans or improve VA data collection, and then distribute Level 1 advocacy talking points for education and outreach on behalf of Burn Pits 360. And when you complete Module 1 and 2 and the exams and quizzes for Modules 1 and 2, you will have risen to the level of being a Level 1 advocate. So Module 1 concludes with a final exam. So there's basically the do-at-home work for this module are two SurveyMonkey instruments. One multiple choice quiz that takes about a minute to complete, and then a second exam, I called it, which is consists of several short answer questions. The kinds of questions you might be asked in an advocacy meeting. And it gives you an opportunity to answer those questions in your own words based on your own knowledge of this issue and based on the information that we've provided to you in the briefing for Module 1. The idea is for this just basically to be a learning opportunity so that we can learn how you would articulate responses to certain questions and and to give you an opportunity to formulate responses to certain questions that you might be asked in an advocacy meeting. And with that, that is the conclusion of Module 1, Section 2. So we can, are we supposed to end at 8:30?
Yeah, we have time, I believe. I think we've still got some time on it. I added some time onto the server deal because we were testing it before we started, so I think there's extra time. If anybody has any questions. One thing I'd add to what Dan said is kind of the intent is to give you guys this material, make the slide decks available to you, and then as you guys go out and start talking to people and you identify people that are interested in this, you can then present them this issue, send them, direct them towards the quiz, get them certified, and so on and so forth. Anybody that we've blessed off on as being certified, can certify other people. We would love that. We want the viral effect to go out. There's just not enough people engaging on this, and this is our Hail Mary solution to that. So thanks for being here, everybody, and we'd be happy to answer some more questions with the time we have remaining until this podcast or the feed drops off the air. So any other questions we can answer? All right. Well, next session will be next Thursday at 7 p.m. Central, same time, same channel. I think we've kind of identified some bugs. We don't want 50 Will Wisners running around. No one wants that. So I think what we'll do is looks like if you click the link individually to the URL, it probably just brought you in without trying to figure out who you are and do all the whiz bang behind the scenes stuff to have a profile. So looks like for the most part, though, we were fairly successful in that. 10 folks managed to make it tonight. B does ask, I'm near Robstown. Am I able to pick up some info there? Rosie?
Yeah, absolutely. If you need some of those resources printed, we're here. We'll provide them to you, as we go along at whatever phase of the module that we're at. And if that's a moment where things are to be distributed, absolutely, you can pick those up here.
And I will send out an email tomorrow through the MailChimp mail app that will link back to a recording. Hopefully this will get it edited and up on YouTube. And those of you that had technical difficulties tonight, Corey, sorry you couldn't hear us, girl. But we'll try to get that fixed so you can listen in at a later date. And all the information that Dan had put out with the offline resources as well as the quizzes, that will also be on that email blast that we send out, as well as on the burnpits360network.org if you go to the resources tab. And Corey, link up.
Yeah, would love to have you guys come by the center. Absolutely. And, I don't want to say it too soon, but congratulations. Y'all be the first graduating class from our advocacy program. So we're so excited to have you guys.
At least module one.
It's
we got another part to level one. Yeah.
But what we're grateful, and I say this, with such a huge smile on my face, because it's been a long time in the making. We're grateful to Will and Dan for their expertise and their time, and so we're just excited to have everyone join us in this effort. So thank you again.
Hey, I want a graduation party too. Somebody says they want a graduation party. I'm assuming that's Susan.
Absolutely.
As this thing goes on, once we actually have volunteers that are working on this stuff and out there in that community, we want to have symposiums. That's part of the plan. We want to have regional get-togethers and potluck suppers and come lean on me kind of peer support stuff, whatever we can get going. And so I would love to have something in St. Louis. We're center of the country. Come visit.
Absolutely. We're excited. Yeah, we're excited to get together. And like Will said, have our semi-annual conference, annual conference, eventually some memberships. So yeah, we're excited. Thank you everyone for joining us.
All right. Well, I think that's it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
See you all next Thursday.
We'll see you all next Thursday. And don't forget, if you've not already subscribed to being a reoccurring donor to Burn Pits 360, we do need your help. Please check us out at burnpits360.kindful.com. And good night, female Will. I will never look so good again. Thank you, Susan. It's been awesome, guys. Take care.
Hey, Will, real quick, for the ones that didn't make it to the first module, to the first class that we had,
yes.
Is that available on the network page, correct?
It is burnpits360network.org. Go to the resources page. The sub drop down tab is advocate resources. The recording of the Blog Talk Radio podcast is there. The PDF copy of module 1 is there. The links to the quizzes are there. So if you're watching this and you've not yet completed that first group of it, please do. These quizzes aren't, really they're just to check the block for us to make sure that you've, done this stuff, listen and are able to hold the conversation. It's really kind of the intent.